John was an English teacher. He lived in a small town in a small house. His house was simple, but it was enough for him. John didn't have much money, but he was happy. He loved his job teaching children how to speak English. Every day he walked to the school with a smile on his face. His students liked him because he was kind and patient. "Good morning, Mr. John," the children would say. "Good morning, everyone," he would reply with a big smile. John believed that teaching was important. He wanted his students to learn English so they could have a better future. He worked hard every day preparing lessons and helping students after class. John didn't need a lot of money or fancy things to be happy. He had his students, his little home, and his peace. But one day, something changed. One afternoon, John was walking home from school when he saw his neighbor, Mr. Carter. Mr. Carter was a wealthy man who lived in a big house. He was always dressed in expensive suits and had a shiny new car. Mr. Carter was rich, but he wasn't very kind. He didn't talk much to people in the town, and many thought he was proud. "Hello, Mr. John," Mr. Carter said with a smile that didn't feel warm. "Good afternoon, Mr. Carter," John replied politely. Mr. Carter looked at John's worn-out shoes and simple clothes. He said, "John, you are a good man, but look at you. You work so hard, and what do you get? Nothing but tired feet and an empty wallet." John shrugged. "I have enough, Mr. Carter. I have my students, and I am happy." Mr. Carter laughed. "Happiness doesn't pay the bills, my friend. I could help you make real money. You are smart, John, and people in the city need good English teachers. You could work for me. I have a business in the city. You would be rich in no time." John hesitated. "Rich, yes. Think about it. You could live in a big house like mine, have a nice car, travel the world. What do you say?" "I will pay you much more than the school ever will," Mr. Carter said, his voice full of temptation. John thought about it that night. He didn't have much money, and sometimes it was hard to pay his bills. The idea of being rich was tempting, but he also loved his students and his simple life. The next morning, John went to school as usual. He taught his lessons, played with the children, and felt the same joy he always did. But in the back of his mind, he kept hearing Mr. Carter's words. You could be rich. During lunch, his friend Emily, another teacher, noticed that John looked worried. "Is something wrong, John?" she asked. "I spoke to Mr. Carter yesterday. He offered me a job in the city. He said I could make a lot of money," John explained. Emily frowned. "But you love teaching here. Would you leave the children for money?" John sighed. "I don't know. It's tempting, Emily. Sometimes it's hard to pay for everything. Maybe Mr. Carter is right. Maybe I should think about my future." Emily smiled gently. "John, you don't need to be rich to be happy. You already have something more valuable than money. You have respect, and you have peace." John thought about Emily's words. She was right. He didn't feel rich, but he had something special. A job he loved, students who admired him, and a place in the community. That was worth more than money. That evening, Mr. Carter came to John's house. He was wearing a fancy suit and carried a briefcase. "John, have you thought about my offer?" Mr. Carter asked, smiling in his usual cold way. "I have," John replied, "but I am not sure. I love my students, and I love teaching." Mr. Carter shook his head. "Your students? They will forget you in a few years. Think about yourself. Think about the money you could have, the places you could go." He opened his briefcase and showed John a contract. "Sign this, and you will start working for me in the city next week. You will be rich in no time." John looked at the contract. The money Mr. Carter offered was a lot. With that kind of money, he could buy a big house, a new car, and never worry about bills again. But then he thought about his students, the joy he felt teaching them, and the simple peace of his life. "I'm sorry, Mr. Carter," John said, stepping back. "I cannot take your offer." Mr. Carter's smile disappeared. "What? Why not? Do you want to stay poor forever?" John shook his head. "I am not poor, Mr. Carter. I may not have a lot of money, but I have something more valuable: peace and happiness. No amount of money can buy that." Mr. Carter frowned and closed his briefcase. "You are a fool, John. You will regret this decision." But John knew he wouldn't regret it. As Mr. Carter left, John felt a weight lift off his shoulders. He had made the right choice. A few days later, John couldn't stop thinking about Mr. Carter's offer. Something felt wrong. Why would a rich man need a simple English teacher like him? Curiosity got the best of him, and John started asking around town about Mr. Carter's business. The more he learned, the more worried he became. John discovered that Mr. Carter wasn't just a successful businessman, he was a fraud. People whispered about how he had tricked many out of their savings. He promised them success, but left them with nothing. His company wasn't honest. It was a front for stealing from others. Mr. Carter's offer to John wasn't about teaching. It was about using him to deceive people. John felt a chill run down his spine. He had almost been pulled into a trap. If he had taken the job, he would have been part of the scam. One morning, on his way to school, John noticed police cars outside Mr. Carter's house. A crowd had gathered, watching as officers carried boxes and computers out of the mansion. "They arrested him," someone whispered. "Mr. Carter's been scamming people for years." John's heart raced. He realized how close he had come to getting involved in Mr. Carter's illegal business. If he had signed that contract, he might have been arrested too. Later, John told Emily what had happened. "I almost took his offer," he said, feeling relieved, "but I knew something wasn't right." Emily smiled. "You did the right thing, John. Trusting your instincts saved you. Always choose honesty over easy temptations. True happiness comes from living with integrity, not from chasing false promises."